Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. I want to talk about guns, but I want to talk about it from the long term. How is the country doing when it comes to the issue of the Second Amendment? Are we more or less pro-Second Amendment than before? This man has a lot to do with it. Dave Kopel, you know him, you love him. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
All right. I want to take a longer view of where the country is compared to, 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, when it comes to the Second Amendment. Because in so many areas, as a gunny, I think we're winning, and in so many areas, I think we're losing. So if you were to step back, and you probably have the best perspective of anyone I know, how are we doing when it comes to this civil right?
Oh, over the long term, very well. In 1971, you wouldn't find many courts that were stepping up to enforce Second Amendment rights. Now the Second Amendment's absolutely on the table as a real part of the Constitution. Sometimes courts take their job seriously and enforce it, sometimes they don't. You know, like with the First Amendment, say in the 1930s or 1940s. Gun ownership is way up. We're now at a level of actually more than one gun per person in the United States.
Let me challenge you on that. I know there are more guns in America than ever before. My concern is that it's in a smaller amount of hands. In other words, those of us who have guns, especially every time we see something crazy, we'll go off and buy another gun. It makes us feel good, and we're stockpiling them for when they come after us. But are there more guns in more hands across America? In other words, are more Americans exercising their civil rights on this?
Well, certainly exercising their civil right to bear arms, absolutely. We're at higher levels than we've been certainly any time in my lifetime for how many people are actually carrying on a day-to-day basis and can do so lawfully. One of the things that people say that, gun ownership in general is declining is the Pew Research Center, which has numbers on household gun ownership levels that really fluctuate wildly from year to year, which makes me question them somewhat, just because I don't think you have 10% of households adding guns in one year and then 7% getting rid of their guns in another year. But households are different than they were 30 or 40 years ago. There are fewer intact families and more divorces and things like that. So that raises the number of households. So say if mom and dad and three kids and they get a divorce, well, if they'd been together, then you'd have one household with dad's guns in them, and you'd say that's one household, one that's 100% gun ownership. They split into two households. Now you've got, dad's still got his guns, but now it's only 50% gun ownership in that micro demographic.
We've used a term, the Overton window, which has been popularized as, well, actually, you give me your definition of the Overton window.
No, you do it.
All right. So the idea is what we do at the Independence Institute is we open up this window of possible political change, not all the way to perhaps where we want it, but we make it politically possible that something could happen in the future, and then politics comes and meets that window at some point if we're pushing it. So instead of being completely purist on an issue and not budging, we'll say, no, let's move it here, giving policymakers the elbow room to actually get something done. And when it comes to guns and the Second Amendment, I see no better example of that over time than what you were just talking about, concealed carry permits, where almost every state in the nation now has a sizable percentage of their population with concealed carry permits, whereas 25 years ago, that would have been completely unheard of. I mean, that was science fiction to some and, apocalyptic thoughts to others.
Yes, that's an example of the success of our federal system, where, as Supreme Court Justice Brandeis said, states can be laboratories for social experiments. So as of, say, 1980, there were very few states where a law-abiding, responsible adult with background check and safety training and all that could lawfully carry a gun for protection in a public place. Some states started reforming that. Indiana, for example, in the 1980s. It got a huge boost in 1988 when Florida enacted its reform law. And
that was 88?
88. Sorry, I think it was actually enacted in 87 or went into effect in 88.
Because I remember when it happened, the whole country shivered because now there'll be gun deaths and Florida will become a murder capital because ordinary people will be allowed to carry their guns concealed.
Right.
Didn't happen.
It did not, and it worked well in Florida. And one of the things we know is there's lots of things in gun control and policy where you're not sure about cause and effect. You know, this state has this law, and then 5 years later there was that change in the crime rate. How much can you associate the one with the other? And social scientists argue about that. But one thing we have the solid data on is the behavior of concealed carry permit holders. Because in Colorado, like lots of other states, the issuing authorities, in Colorado, the county sheriffs, have to issue annual reports on how many applications did you have, how many permits did you issue, how many permits did you renew, it's a 5-year cycle in Colorado, and how many permits did you revoke. In Colorado, the revocation procedure is very easy. The sheriff just revokes it. And
he has sole authority to do so?
Yes. And
so is there any due process, or can you just say, this guy's, I think, is dangerous, I'm taking away his permit?
The sheriff, if he's following the law, would say, based on this person's behavior, putting aside the background check and the safety training, I won't issue because I have specific evidence about this person that the person would be a danger to himself or others. And if that circumstance arises after the permit's issued, the sheriff can revoke it. Now, if the person wants to appeal, they can go to court, and the burden of proof is on the sheriff, and he's got to prove the case with specific evidence. But in Colorado and elsewhere, the number of revocations for anything, whether it's being arrested or mental health or anything else, is very, very small. Concealed carry permittees are not perfect, all of them. You know, now probably 16 million or so of them, but they are statistically far more law-abiding than almost any other demographic group you could find. And nuns are probably more law-abiding.
Not the nuns that taught me, I can guarantee you. The 9% of Colorado adults, 9% have a concealed carry permit. That seems an astounding number to me. It means, you think of 10 of your friends, one of them is potentially packing heat legally. And that becomes a tipping point that, wait a minute, she does that and she does that? Well, maybe I ought to think about it. Maybe it's not as crazy as it once sounded. I think the acceptance of gay marriage really worked that way. I mean, my brother-in-law is gay. I guess they're okay too. And there was an acceptance that happened, and it accelerated. Do you see an acceleration of the acceptance of this civil right in the same way? I mean, is this going to be an exponential thing that people understand gun rights better?
No, not exponential in the literal sense
Right.
of how something that increases exponentially suddenly starts going up almost in a straight line. But yeah, more like with gay rights, where it's a one person at a time sort of conversion. And I think absolutely the gay rights advocates would say, yes, we got lots of media and we had important financial backers and all that, and the celebrities and that stuff, but the most important thing by far was that one at a time individuals coming out and telling their families or their social circles that they were gay or bisexual or whatever. And then the people see, oh, they're not all like, these
Right.
guys in San Francisco walking around with ridiculous costumes on a gay rights parade.
Just because you didn't like the Village People doesn't mean. All right, bring it.
They were well dressed.
They were well dressed. Bring it back here. The reason these things have happened, and it seems to explode on the scene, is because of the work of you and other people who have been doing this work literally for decades. Explain this one to me, because when the Heller decision came down and it affirmed what we knew, which was the Second Amendment, just like the First Amendment, is an individual guaranteed right by our Constitution, not some collective. I was like, I just wish this could have happened earlier. You're the guy who said it wouldn't have happened earlier. We didn't have the research ready. What did you mean by that?
So from the founding of this country through or at least the European settlement starting back in 1606 in Virginia, people had express written guarantees of the right to arms, like the Virginia Charter of 1606 and then the New England Charter of 1620. And that sensibility carried forward. It was reaffirmed in early state constitutions and, of course, in the Second Amendment. And throughout the 19th century, it was almost universally understood that, yes, just like you said, it's like the First Amendment. It's not an infinite right. You can have some controls on speech, as you can have some controls on guns. But it's a normal individual right of all law-abiding Americans. starting in the 1960s and then accelerating in the 1970s, there was a sort of a great forgetting about that history, and there was very scant scholarship at the time on original history. And so people claimed, oh, the Second Amendment is not an individual right. It's not a right of the people, but it's really a right of the government. It's what they called a collective right. Like they have collective property in communist China, which is theoretically it belongs to all the people, but actually it just belongs to the government, which can take it away whenever the government wants. And to recover understanding of that original meaning, and then of the historical meaning in the decades and century following it, there had to be research. And unfortunately, it's getting easier and easier to do that original research. Not even just the internet as in the today, but things were more accessible in the 70s. It was easier to travel, to go to the Library of Congress, to look up documents in 1980 than it was in 1930, just because people had more money for travel.
And so the work that you did, and a handful of other scholars, laid the foundation so that when the Heller case came, this crucial case for gun rights, when they wanted to do legal research of what did the founders really mean, they could look into all the law journals that you've written, all the legal chronicles that you've done, and find that stuff. If the Heller case was done 20 years earlier, would we have had a different outcome?
Possibly with that court. I think there's the Supreme Court, the Nixon appointees were Republicans, and so they were conservative in the sense of the time. But what they meant by conservative is the courts have gone way too far in protecting people's individual rights in general, and we need to start cutting back on that.
All right, less than a minute here. Leap forward. Now that we've got all this pressure against so-called assault weapons, now that we've got pressure against media companies and other companies not to sell guns to people who legally should be able to have them, or have videos on YouTube or any of this stuff, 20 years from now, does this right expand or does it contract?
It depends on, as with every right in American history, it depends on what people do. As James Madison said, constitutions are just parchment barriers unless they're backed by the hearts and minds of the public.
Which means the work that you do and those who follow you is crucial on all these civil liberties.
Because we want to protect public safety by telling people about the facts and show that there's lots of ways we can be safe and have strong rights.
Dave Kopel, thank you so much. Stay tuned.